The Sumerian Tablets did not begin with a warning. They began with a memory, pressed into clay by hands that were already thousands of years removed from whatever they were trying to describe. These fragments carried something that no empire, no flood, no passage of time has been able to fully erase. A story, perhaps the oldest story humanity has ever tried to tell. Not a myth invented to explain the stars, not a fable crafted to teach children obedience, but something that feels, even now, like the echo of an actual remembering. Like someone, somewhere, a very long time ago, witnessed something so vast and so final that they could not let it die with them. They wrote of a world that came before ours, a world shaped by beings of immense age and knowledge, remembered in the oldest texts as the Anunnaki. And they wrote, in fragments and in whispers, of how that world ended, not quickly, not cleanly, not in a single fire or a single flood, though fire is mentioned and flood is mentioned, and the earth itself is described as trembling in ways that no living generation had witnessed. The ending they remembered was something slower and stranger than destruction. It was a withdrawal, a dimming, as though something vast and luminous had turned away from the world, and the world had grown quieter in its absence, and human beings had been left standing in that quiet, trying to remember what the light had looked like. What destroyed the Anunnaki world? Some of the tablets suggest it was not one thing, it was many. It was the weight of choices made across spans of time so long they have no name in any human language. It was catastrophe, yes, but also betrayal, forgetting, and perhaps something even older than either of those. A cycle so ancient that the Anunnaki themselves may have seen it coming and could not stop it. Tonight, we are going to follow that memory. We are going to move slowly through what the Sumerian tradition may have preserved, not as history, not as proof, but as something more fragile and more honest than either of those things. As a remembering, as the careful, imperfect attempt of early human minds to hold on to something immense before it faded entirely from the world. So let your breath slow now. Let the noise of the present fall away. And listen, because this is a story that has been waiting a very long time to be heard again. There is something the ancient Mesopotamian world understood about time that we have perhaps forgotten. They did not see it as a line. They did not imagine history as a road moving forward from darkness into light, from ignorance into knowledge, from primitive into advanced. That is a story we tell ourselves, a story that feels natural to us because we live inside it. But the people who pressed those earliest tablets into being held a different understanding, one that is harder to articulate, but which surfaces again and again in the fragments they left behind. Time to them was cyclical, not in a simple or mechanical way, but in the way that seasons are cyclical, the way that rivers rise and fall, the way that something can be lost so completely that future generations do not even know to mourn it. And then slowly, imperfectly, something of it returns. They believed the world had been shaped before, not once, but perhaps many times. And in each shaping, so something was given to the earth, knowledge, structure, memory. And in each ending, most of that gift was taken back, or lost, or buried so deeply beneath catastrophe and forgetting that only the faintest outline of it remained. What survived was not the knowledge itself, but the memory that such knowledge had once existed. And that memory, fragile and incomplete as it was, became the seed of the next beginning. This is the quiet that lives beneath the Sumerian tablets, not a record of what happened, but a grief for what was lost. The Anunnaki, as they are remembered across those fragments, were not gods in the way that later civilizations would come to understand gods: distant, perfect, untouchable. They are described in ways that feel almost uncomfortably close. They debated among themselves. They disagreed. They experienced something that the ancient texts render in terms that suggest weariness or longing, or the particular sorrow of beings who have watched too many cycles turn. They made decisions that carried consequences they could not fully foresee, and those decisions, accumulated across vast stretches of time, may have contributed to the ending that the tablets seem to be circling, always approaching, but never quite stating directly. Perhaps because the people writing those tablets did not fully understand what they were writing. Perhaps because they were transcribing something older than their own civilization, fragments passed down through oral traditions that stretched back beyond any written record, beyond any city, beyond any settled agriculture, to a time when human beings, and whatever the Anunnaki were, existed in a relationship that the later world had only the dimmest memory of. What do the tablets actually say? This is where we must move carefully, because the tablets say many things, and they say them in ways that resist simple interpretation. They speak of a time before the Great Flood, not just one flood, but the memory of a flood so total, so world reshaping, that it became the dividing line in ancient consciousness between what came before and what came after. Before the flood, the texts suggest, kingship descended from the heavens. The great cities were established. The Anunnaki were present in ways they would later cease to be. The world was ordered according to a design that was not entirely human in origin. And then something changed. The texts describe it in different ways in different fragments, which itself may be significant, as though the memory of what happened was preserved in multiple traditions that had drifted apart over time, each retaining pieces of the whole, but none holding the complete picture. In some fragments, what changed was the nature of the earth itself. The land grew brackish. The floods came not as gifts, but as destruction. The carefully maintained balance between water and soil began to collapse. In others, what changed was something less physical and more difficult to name, a withdrawal of attention, perhaps, or a breaking of some ancient agreement between the Anunnaki and the world they had shaped. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest extended narratives to survive, the story of the flood is embedded within a much larger story about exhaustion. The lesser gods, the Igigi, had been laboring for immense spans of time, digging the rivers, shaping the land, maintaining the physical infrastructure of a world that required constant effort to sustain. And they grew tired. They put down their tools. They refused to continue. And it was this refusal, this moment of divine exhaustion that set in motion the chain of events leading toward catastrophe. Humanity was shaped in this telling, partly as a response to that exhaustion, to take on the burden of the labor, to maintain what the gods could no longer sustain alone. But this solution carried within it the seed of new problems. Humanity multiplied, and with multiplication came noise. The texts use that word in ways that feel almost deliberately ambiguous. Noise. The great gods could not sleep for the noise of humanity. And this noise, this overwhelming, sun proliferating presence of human life, disturbed something at the deepest levels of the Anunnaki world. It pressed against boundaries. It created pressures that the old order had not been designed to accommodate. And so the decision was made, not by all of them, and not without disagreement, to allow the flood. But here is the detail that the tablets seem to want us to hold on to, the detail that separates this memory from a simple story of divine punishment. Not all of the Anunnaki agreed. Enki, remembered as the keeper of deep wisdom, the one whose understanding ran beneath the surface of things, the way water runs beneath dry ground, did not agree. He found a way to warn. He found a way to ensure that something survived, not because he defied the decision openly, but because he understood something the others perhaps did not, that in erasing everything, they would erase themselves as well, that the world they had shaped and the beings they had shaped it alongside were not separate from them in the way that the decision assumed, that to destroy the world utterly was to lose something of themselves. This tension between the Anunnaki who chose erasure and the one who chose preservation may be one of the oldest moral memories humanity carries. The idea that even among beings of immense power and ancient wisdom, there is disagreement about what life is worth, about whether a world that has grown complicated and painful and noisy is still worth saving, or whether it is cleaner, simpler, more logical to begin again. Enki chose to remember, and because he chose to remember, we are here. But the flood, even in this telling, was not the end of the Anunnaki world. It was a pivot point, a moment of rupture after which nothing was quite the same. The tablets suggest that after the flood, so the relationship between the Anunnaki and the human world shifted in ways that were gradual at first, then accelerating, then complete. They were still present. They were still remembered as present. The great temple complexes of early Sumer, the ziggurats rising in stepped tiers toward the sky, were built as houses for them, as places where that presence might still be accessed, still felt, and still communicated with. But something had changed in the quality of that presence. Something had withdrawn slightly, as though the flood had cost the Anunnaki something they could not recover, as though the act of choosing destruction, even if that choice was later mourned, even if Enki's preservation was honored, had introduced a distance into the relationship that had not existed before. The tablets describe the great gods as dwelling in places increasingly remote from ordinary human experience. The mountain, the deep water, the space between earth and sky that has no name. They were still there, the traditions insisted, but they were harder to reach. Their voices were quieter. Their interventions in human affairs grew less direct, more symbolic, more easily confused with natural events. And human beings, left increasingly to manage the world that had been given to them, began to forget the details of what had been given and by whom. This is perhaps the most quietly devastating thing the Sumerian tablets preserve. Not the story of catastrophe itself, but the story of the forgetting that followed, the slow erosion of memory across generations, the way that beings who had once been understood as present and specific and real gradually became mythological, larger, more abstract, their original nature obscured by the accumulated layers of retelling and reinterpretation. The Anunnaki did not disappear all at once. They faded, and in the fading, they left behind a world that carried their shape in its cities, in its laws, in its understanding of the stars and the cycles of seasons and the movement of water, but could no longer remember clearly where that shape had come from. We are still living in that world, still carrying that shape, still, perhaps, in the earliest hours of the night, when the mind grows quiet and the distance between now and then feels briefly crossable, still catching the faintest edge of something we cannot quite name. Something that feels like a memory we were not supposed to lose. There is a particular kind of forgetting that is not the same as loss. When something is truly lost, it leaves a clean absence, a space where something was, now empty, now silent, now indistinguishable from the space around it. But the kind of forgetting the Sumerian tablets seem to be describing is different from that. It is the forgetting of a dream that you know you had, that you can feel the weight of upon waking, whose emotional residue lingers in your chest all morning, even as the images dissolve. You do not remember what you dreamed, but you know that something happened. You know that wherever your mind traveled in those hours of darkness, it encountered something significant, something that mattered, something that changed the quality of your inner world, even as it slipped beyond the reach of your waking memory. This is how the ancient world seems to have held the Anunnaki, not as a clear memory, not as a documented history, but as a felt presence that's just beyond the edge of articulation, something that the earliest human civilizations knew they were supposed to remember, something they built their temples and their rituals and their astronomical observations around the attempt to recover, so it without ever being entirely certain what it was they were reaching toward. The ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia are perhaps the most physical expression of this reaching. Those massive stepped structures, rising from the flat alluvial plains of what is now Iraq, in tiers of mud brick and bitumen, oriented toward the cardinal directions, their summits lost in early morning haze, were not built as monuments to human achievement. They were built as thresholds, as places where the distance between the human world and whatever lay beyond it might be briefly, carefully, deliberately narrowed. The texts that describe their purpose speak of the god descending to the house prepared for him, of the high priest ascending in darkness before dawn to wait in the chamber at the summit, of something that was understood not as metaphor, but as genuine contact, the possibility, maintained through precise ritual and unbroken tradition, of the presence that had withdrawn returning however briefly, to speak. What were they hoping to hear? Perhaps they were hoping to understand what had gone wrong, because the Sumerian tradition is not simply a memory of greatness. Woven through it, inseparable from the stories of the Anunnaki's gifts and the world they helped shape, is a persistent and quietly anguished question. Why did it end? Why did the order that had been established with such care and such apparent permanence collapse into flood and silence and forgetting? What was the nature of the failure, and was it theirs or ours, or something shared between beings whose relationship was always more complicated than the simple categories of creator and created could contain? The tablets offer several answers, and none of them are complete. One answer lives in the story of Enlil, remembered as the Lord of Wind and Storm, but the one who authorized the flood, the one whose patience with the noise and proliferations of humanity finally broke. Enlil is not a villain in these texts, and this is important. He is not described as cruel or malicious or indifferent to suffering in the way that a simple antagonist would be. He is described as overwhelmed, as a being who had maintained order across spans of time so immense that the weight of that maintenance had become unbearable. His decision to allow the flood was not the decision of a tyrant. It was, perhaps, the decision of someone who had grown so exhausted by the complexity of what had been created that the simplicity of erasure seemed, in that moment, like mercy. This is a deeply uncomfortable memory for humanity to carry, because it suggests that the ending of the Anunnaki world was not caused by evil. It was caused by weariness, by the accumulated strain of maintaining something vast and intricate and imperfect across a timescale that dwarfs anything human civilization has yet experienced. It was caused by the particular despair that comes not from hatred, but from love grown too heavy to hold. Enlil loved the order he had helped create, and he destroyed it because he could no longer bear to watch it strain against its own limits. And then there is the answer that lives in the story of Inanna. She is perhaps the most vivid of the Anunnaki as they are remembered, the goddess of love and war and the morning star, whose descent into the underworld is preserved in one of the oldest complete narratives that human hands have ever written down. The story of her descent is usually read as a myth of death and resurrection, of the cycle of seasons, of the necessary journey into darkness that precedes any true return to light. And perhaps it is all of those things. But there is another way to read it, a quieter way, more suited to the hour before sleep, that suggests something different. Inanna descended because she wanted to understand what lay beneath. She gave up, at each of the 7 gates, one of her divine attributes: her crown, her measuring rod, her lapis lazuli necklace, her breastplate, her golden ring, her lapis lazuli scepter, her royal robe. She arrived in the underworld naked and bowed low. She was killed there, hung on a hook, left for 3 days in the darkness. And then, through the intervention of Enki, always the one who finds the way through, she was restored, and she ascended, and she returned. But she did not return unchanged. The texts are subtle about this, in the way that the oldest stories are always subtle about the things that matter most. They do not say directly what Inanna lost in the underworld, what she understood there that she had not understood before, but there is a quality in the stories that follow her return, a sharpness, a severity, a willingness to make decisions that the earlier Inanna might have hesitated over, that suggests the descent cost her something beyond her divine regalia, something interior, some quality of innocence, perhaps, or of faith in the order she had helped maintain. Perhaps she understood, in the underworld, that the order was not permanent. Perhaps she saw, in that place of absolute ending, what the world she had helped shape was moving toward, not immediately, not in any single catastrophe, but across the long arc of a cycle so vast that even the Anunnaki could not stand outside it, could not remain untouched by it, would themselves eventually be carried by it into a kind of ending. This is the possibility that the tablets seem to approach most carefully, most obliquely, as though even the people writing them sensed that it was almost too large to hold in language, that the Anunnaki world was not destroyed from outside, that no external force came and broke what had been built, that the ending came from within the cycle itself, from the nature of cycles, which is that they turn always, regardless of what has been built upon them, regardless of how carefully the builders have worked, regardless of how much knowledge and power and accumulated wisdom has gone into the making of the thing that must eventually unmake itself. The flood was real in this reading, but the flood was a symptom, not a cause. The cause was older than the flood. It was the slow accumulation of imbalance, not dramatic imbalance, not the kind that announces itself in sudden catastrophe, but the quiet, incremental kind that gathers across millennia like sediment on a riverbed, layer by invisible layer, until one day the river can no longer flow as it once did, and the land around it begins to change, and the people who have always lived beside it find that the world they knew has become a different world without any single moment they can point to and say, there, that was when it changed. The Anunnaki, if the tablets are reaching towards something real, may have felt that accumulation, may have understood long before the flood, so that something was shifting beneath the order they had established, that the balance between what the earth could sustain and what was being asked of it had begun to tip, that the carefully maintained relationship between their world and the human world they had helped bring into being was generating pressures that neither side had fully anticipated, and they disagreed about what to do. This is the detail that surfaces again and again across different fragments, different traditions, so different attempts to remember the same vast story. They disagreed. The Anunnaki were not unified in their response to what was coming. Some chose to intervene more directly, to attempt to correct the imbalance through force. Some chose to withdraw, to allow the cycle to complete itself, believing that what would emerge from the ending would carry forward what was most essential. Some, like Enki, chose a third path, neither intervention nor withdrawal, but careful preservation, the quiet passing of seeds through the fire so that something might grow again on the other side. None of these choices saved the world as it had been, but perhaps saving the world as it had been was never the point. Perhaps the point, if the tablets are memory rather than myth, if they are the imperfect echo of something that actually happened in ages too remote for us to fully imagine, perhaps the point was always what survived the ending, what was carried through. What a being like Enki understood that the others, in their exhaustion or their withdrawal or their desperate interventions, had lost sight of. That the ending of a world is not the ending of everything, that something always remains, that in the silence after the great wave has passed and the waters have begun slowly to recede, there's always a hillside, always a vessel resting on that hillside, always a pair of hands opening a door onto a changed world and beginning slowly, carefully, with the weight of everything that has been lost still present in every movement, to build again. But what was it exactly that was being built again? This is the question that the post flood Sumerian world seems to have lived inside of, quietly, for generations. The great cities rose, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, their foundations pressed into the same alluvial soil that the flood had left behind, their temples oriented toward the same stars that the pre-flood world had watched. The knowledge of agriculture returned, the knowledge of irrigation, of writing, of law, of astronomy, all of it returned, or perhaps more accurately, all of it was recovered, pieced together from what had survived the breaking, reassembled with the patient and grief-tinged care of people who understood, on some level they could not fully articulate, that they were working from an incomplete copy of something that had once been whole. The Sumerian king lists those strange and extraordinary documents that attempt to trace the lineage of rulership from before the flood to after it, preserve this sense of incompleteness in a way that is almost unbearable to sit with if you let yourself feel what they are actually saying. Before the flood, the texts tell us, kings ruled for spans of time that no human life could contain, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, single reigns stretching across durations that the later world could only gesture toward with numbers that had lost their meaning through sheer magnitude. And then the flood came, and then kingship descended again from the heavens, and the reigns became shorter, dramatically, suddenly, irreversibly shorter. Still long by any standard we would recognize, hundreds of years in the earliest post-flood listings, but compressed almost beyond recognition compared to what had come before, as though whatever quality had allowed those immense pre-flood reigns, whatever connection to a source of duration and continuity that the earliest kings had possessed, had been diminished by the catastrophe, had leaked away into the floodwaters and not fully returned. What the king lists may be remembering in their strange numerical language is the withdrawal of the Anunnaki presence from direct participation in the human world. Before the flood, in this reading, the boundary between the Anunnaki and the earliest human rulers was permeable in ways it would later cease to be. The immense reigns were not the lifespans of individual human beings. They were the duration of a kind of governance that was not entirely human in nature, that drew on something beyond ordinary human capacity for its continuity and its coherence. And when that something withdrew, when the Anunnaki receded from direct presence into the more distant relationship that characterized the post flood world, the rains contracted to reflect the purely human capacity that remained. This is a melancholy way to read a list of numbers. But the Sumerian scribes who compiled those lists were not perhaps simply recording administrative history. They were preserving a memory of diminishment, of a world that had once been larger, so in some essential way, than the world they themselves inhabited. And they were doing so with the particular Mesopotamian combination of precision and grief, setting down the numbers exactly, maintaining the record faithfully, even knowing that the record described something they could never recover. The temples were the other great attempt at recovery. In the theology of early Sumer, the temple was not simply a place of worship in the way that later religions would come to understand worship. It was a functional structure, a technology almost, though that word carries implications of mechanism and material that do not quite fit. It was a place designed to maintain the connection between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. A place where the boundary could be thinned, where the presence that had withdrawn might be coaxed through precise ritual and unbroken devotion and the accumulated weight of generations of careful attention into returning briefly to the world it had left. The high priest who ascended the ziggurat in darkness was not performing a symbolic act. He believed, and the tradition that sustained him believed, that what he was doing was real, that the chamber at the summit was genuinely a threshold, that the being he was waiting for might genuinely arrive, not as a vision, not as a feeling of spiritual warmth, but as a presence, specific, particular, bringing with it the quality of knowing that had characterized the Anunnaki world before the flood. The kind of knowing that was not accumulated through study or observation, but simply present, the way light is present, the way the depth of water is present, even when the surface is still. And perhaps, sometimes, something did arrive. The tablets speak with enough specificity about the nature of these encounters, the instructions given, the knowledge transmitted, the corrections made to the management of the city and its surrounding lands, to suggest that whatever the high priests were experiencing in those summit chambers, it was not nothing. Something was happening at those thresholds. Something was being exchanged, or attempted, or remembered together in the space between the human world and whatever the Anunnaki had become in their withdrawal. But the quality of the contact was changing. This is the subtle tragedy that runs beneath the official theology of Sumerian temple culture. The rituals grew more elaborate over time, not less. The requirements for maintaining the divine presence grew more demanding, more precise, more hedged with conditions and prohibitions. And this elaboration, this increasing complexity of the apparatus required to sustain contact, was itself a sign of the contact's weakening. When something is present fully and naturally, you do not need elaborate machinery to maintain it. The machinery becomes necessary precisely when the presence has thinned to the point where it can be lost entirely if the conditions are not exactly right. The Anunnaki were becoming harder to reach, and the human world was changing in ways that made the reaching more difficult still. The cities grew. The population of the river valleys expanded beyond anything the earliest settlements had been designed to accommodate. The demands of feeding and organizing and defending those populations generated pressures that pulled human attention further and further from the careful and slow, contemplative work of maintaining the threshold. Kings who had once been primarily ritual figures, whose most important function was to maintain the connection between the human city and the divine order it was meant to reflect, became increasingly military figures, increasingly administrative figures, increasingly concerned with the practical management of a world that was growing more complex and more resistant to simple order with every generation. And as the kings changed, so did the Anunnaki. Or rather, so did the human understanding of the Anunnaki. This is perhaps the most important shift that the tablets document, though they do not document it directly. They document it in the gaps between things, in the way that the Anunnaki of the later texts feel subtly different from the Anunnaki of the earlier ones. More distant, more inscrutable, more purely divine in the sense of being beyond ordinary human comprehension or contact. The early Anunnaki debated and wept and grew tired and disagreed. The later ones issued decrees from remote heights, and their inner lives became inaccessible to the tradition that claimed to preserve their memory. They were becoming myth, not because they had never been anything else. That question remains open, remains perhaps permanently open, which is part of what makes these traditions so endlessly worth sitting with. But because the living memory of what they actually were was fading, the people who had maintained direct contact with whatever the Anunnaki presence was had lived and died. The people who came after them maintained the rituals, but could not be certain they were achieving the same results. And the people who came after them maintained the rituals because the rituals had always been maintained, and the tradition said they were important, and tradition has its own momentum that does not require direct experience to sustain itself. But tradition without direct experience is a map without a landscape. It preserves the shape of something that was once real, but the territory it describes has shifted, and if you try to navigate by the map alone, you will find yourself in places the map does not account for, looking for landmarks that are no longer there. The great civilization of Sumer did not collapse all at once either. Like the Anunnaki presence it had been built to honor and maintain, it faded. It was absorbed and overlaid and partially preserved by the Akkadian culture that followed it, and then by the Babylonian, and then by others, in an unbroken chain of partial remembering and partial forgetting that has brought us finally to here, to this night, to the strange and quiet miracle of sitting with fragments of the oldest human writing and feeling beneath the scholarly apparatus of translation and interpretation and academic debate, something that moves like a current beneath still water, something that feels like a memory we were not supposed to lose. The Anunnaki world was not destroyed by a single catastrophe. It was eroded by time, by the slow accumulation of distance between what had been known directly and what could only be approximated through ritual and tradition. It was eroded by the growth of human complexity beyond what the original design had anticipated. It was eroded by the exhaustion of beings, divine or otherwise, who had maintained something immense for longer than any system, however carefully built, can sustain itself without renewal. And it was eroded, perhaps most quietly and most devastatingly, by forgetting, by the simple, inevitable, deeply human process of generations passing and memories thinning and the living reality of a thing becoming, slowly, a story about a thing, and then a story about a story, and then a symbol, and then a word in a dead language pressed into clay that would lie buried for thousands of years before being found again by people who could only partially read it. We are those people, and we are still, even now, only partially reading it. There is a city that should not exist, or rather, there is a city whose existence asks questions that the official history of human civilization has not yet found comfortable ways to answer. Eridu, the oldest of the Sumerian cities, according to both the archaeological record and the ancient texts themselves, sitting at the edge of what was once the meeting place of the great rivers and the sea, in a landscape that has shifted so dramatically over the millennia that the city now rests far inland, surrounded by desert, its ancient shoreline swallowed by time and silt and the slow rearrangement of the earth's surface. The Sumerians believed Eridu was the first city, not the first city they knew of, not the first city in their region, the first city, the place where civilization, organized, intentional, sustained human life in community, began. And more than that, the place where the boundary between the Anunnaki world and the human world was thinnest, the place where Enki himself was said to dwell, in his house beneath the waters, in that deep freshwater ocean the Sumerians called the Abzu, the source of all wisdom, all creative power, all knowledge that flowed upward into the world from whatever lay beneath it. Eridu was not simply a city, it was a threshold city, a city built at the place where what is above and what is below come closest to touching. And what the archaeologists have found at Eridu, beneath the layers of later occupation and abandonment and the slow accumulation of blown sand, is a sequence of temples so ancient and so continuous that it reaches back to the very earliest moments of settled human life in that region. 18 temples, one built upon the ruins of the last, each one slightly larger than the one beneath it, each one maintaining the same orientation, the same basic design, the same essential relationship to whatever it was the builders understood themselves to be maintaining contact with. 18 temples, stretching back perhaps 7,000 years before the present. And beneath the earliest of them, beneath the oldest structure that the excavations have so far reached, there is evidence of ritual activity that predates the structure itself. Offerings made in an open space before any building existed to contain them, before any organized religion, in the sense we usually mean by that term, had developed to give those offerings a doctrinal framework. Someone was making offerings at that spot before there was a temple, before there was a city. Before there was, by the conventional account, a civilization capable of understanding what an offering was for. This is the kind of detail that the Sumerian tradition, read in a certain light, and seems almost to have anticipated, because the texts describe Eridu not as a place that humans discovered and then decided to treat as sacred, but as a place that was already sacred before humans arrived at it. A place that had been prepared, that had been designated by the Anunnaki as the point of connection between their world and the world they were in the process of helping to bring into being. The word the texts use for this designation carries connotations of something more than simple selection. It suggests a quality that was intrinsic to the place itself, something in the nature of the land at that particular confluence of fresh water and salt water, that particular meeting of the rivers and the sea that made it uniquely suited to serve as a threshold, as though the geography itself was part of the design, as though whoever had chosen that spot understood something about the relationship between landscape and consciousness, between the physical arrangement of water and earth and the capacity of the human mind to reach beyond itself toward whatever lies at the edges of its ordinary perception. Enki chose Eridu because the Abzu was there, and the Abzu, that deep freshwater source, that underground ocean of creative power and accumulated wisdom, was not chosen. It simply was. So, a feature of the world that predated the Anunnaki themselves, perhaps. Something they found rather than made. Something they recognized and built around, the way a river bends around a stone that is harder than the water, incorporating the obstacle into its path and moving forward changed by the encounter. This suggests something important about the nature of the Anunnaki world that the later, more anthropomorphic versions of the tradition tend to obscure. They were not omnipotent. They were not unlimited. They worked within constraints, physical, geographical, perhaps temporal, that shaped what they could do and how they could do it. They were, in this reading, less like gods in the conventional sense, and more like beings of immense knowledge and extended capability, who were nevertheless subject to the nature of the world they inhabited, who had to find the places where the world's own deep structure aligned with what they were trying to accomplish, who had to work with the grain of things rather than against it. And this, perhaps, is part of what made their ending possible, because a being that is truly omnipotent cannot be ended, cannot be eroded, cannot be worn down by the slow accumulation of imbalance and distance and forgetting. But a being that works within the constraints of a world that depends on certain conditions being maintained, certain connections being kept alive, because certain thresholds remaining open, such a being can be ended simply by the gradual degradation of the conditions on which it depends. You do not need to destroy the Anunnaki. You only need to close the thresholds. And the thresholds close slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, through the growth of cities that pull human attention toward administration and warfare and the management of complexity, through the accumulation of noise, in the ancient sense of that word, the overwhelming, the proliferating presence of human need and human conflict and human desire that presses against the delicate fabric of maintained contact until the fabric thins and tears, and finally dissolves entirely, leaving behind only the memory that it once existed. The city of Ur gives us another piece of this picture. Ur, which rose to its greatest prominence in the period historians call the Third Dynasty, roughly 4,000 years ago by our current reckoning. So, though the Sumerians themselves would have placed it within a much longer and more complex chronology, was perhaps the most complete expression of what Sumerian civilization was attempting to achieve. Its ziggurat still partially stands, rising from the flat southern Iraqi landscape in tiers of baked brick, its mass and its presence still communicating across 4 millennia something of the intention that built it. And Ur's records, the extraordinary administrative tablets that survived its eventual destruction, the hymns and lamentations and royal inscriptions that have been painstakingly translated over the last century and a half, give us the clearest picture we have of what it felt like to live in a world that was trying to maintain a connection it could feel slipping away. The lament for the destruction of Ur is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of human writing. It describes the abandonment of the city by its divine protectors, not dramatically, not as a single moment of divine wrath, but as something more unbearable than that, a turning away, a decision made in the divine assembly to withdraw protection from a city that had been beloved, that had been carefully tended, that had done nothing different from what it had always done, and yet found itself one morning unprotected, found itself without warning or explanation in a world where the divine presence that had sustained it had simply chosen to be elsewhere. The goddess Ningal pleads before the divine assembly in the lament. She asks that the decision be reconsidered. She describes the city she loves, its people, its temples, its carefully maintained order, and asks why it must be abandoned. And the assembly does not answer her with reasons. It answers her with silence, with a kind of silence, though that is not an absence of response, but a response in itself, the silence of a decision already made, of a process already in motion, of something that has moved beyond the reach of pleading or argument or love. The city is abandoned. The enemy enters. The people weep in language so raw and so immediate that it crosses 4,000 years without losing any of its force. But what the lament is really describing, beneath the specific historical catastrophe of Ur's military defeat, beneath the grief of a particular city for its particular destruction, is something larger. It is describing the experience of living in a world from which the divine presence has withdrawn, of maintaining the rituals and the temples and the careful observances of a tradition that was built to sustain a connection, and finding that the connection is no longer there, that the threshold is closed, that the chamber at the summit of the ziggurat is simply a chamber now, stone and brick and silence and nothing more. This is the ending that the Sumerian tradition most deeply mourns. Not the flood, not the military defeats, not the political collapses of one dynasty after another in the long, turbulent history of the river valleys, but the withdrawal, the turning away, the moment when the world that had been shaped with such care and such intention by beings of immense knowledge became simply a human world, subject to all the limitations and all the mortality and all the beautiful, terrible, unredeemed suffering that a purely human world entails. The Anunnaki did not die in that moment. The tablets do not suggest that they died. They suggest something more complicated and in some ways more devastating, that they are still there, somewhere, in the deep water, in the space between earth and sky, in whatever lies beyond the thresholds that human civilization has spent the last several thousand years gradually closing. Still present, perhaps, in the way that the deep current of a river is present beneath its surface, invisible, unfelt by anything that does not reach down far enough to touch it, but real, still moving, still carrying whatever it has always carried toward whatever it has always been moving toward. And the world they left behind, our world, this fragile and extraordinary and noise-filled world, is still, in its deepest structures, the world they shaped, still oriented toward thresholds that most of us have forgotten how to find, still carrying, in its oldest stories and its most persistent dreams and its inexplicable sense that something immense lies just beyond the edge of ordinary perception, the memory of a connection that was once alive and may not, even now, be entirely dead. There is a question that the tablets never ask directly. They circle it. They approach it from different angles, in different fragments, in different traditions that have drifted apart over millennia of separate transmission and partial preservation. But they never ask it plainly, perhaps because the people who compiled them did not have the distance necessary to see it clearly, or perhaps because some questions are too large to ask directly, too large to fit inside the frame of a single sentence, too vast to survive the compression that direct asking requires. The question is this: did the Anunnaki know from the beginning that it would end this way? Not the flood specifically, not the particular shape of any single catastrophe, but the larger arc, the slow withdrawal, the thinning of contact, the gradual transformation of living presence into myth, and myth into symbol, and symbol into words pressed into clay that would lie buried for thousands of years before being partially recovered by people who could only partially read them. Did they see that coming? Did they build toward it deliberately, the way a teacher builds toward the moment when the student no longer needs the teacher, working themselves carefully and with full intention out of the necessity of their own presence? This is perhaps the most quietly radical way to read the Sumerian tradition, not as a story of loss, not as a lament for something taken away by catastrophe or negligence or the cruel turning of an indifferent cycle, but as a story of deliberate graduation, of a relationship between beings of immense ancient knowledge and a younger, still forming humanity that was always intended to move, eventually, toward independence, toward a world that was fully and irreversibly human, not because the Anunnaki abandoned it in failure or withdrew in exhaustion, but because that was always where the relationship was pointing, because the gift they came to give was not their permanent presence, but the capacity slowly developed over immense spans of time for humanity to sustain itself without them. Enki's choice to preserve rather than erase, begins to look different in this light. He did not save humanity from the flood simply out of compassion, though compassion may have been part of it. He saved humanity because humanity was the vessel, because whatever had been built across the long relationship between the Anunnaki world and the emerging human world was not stored in the temples or the cities or the administrative structures of early civilization. It was stored in the people, in the accumulated capacity of human consciousness, shaped over millennia of contact with beings whose knowledge ran deeper than anything the young species could yet fully access or understand. The cities could be destroyed, the tablets could be buried, the temples could be abandoned, and their rituals forgotten. But if the people survived, something essential survived with them, not as explicit knowledge, not as the ability to reconstruct the specific technologies or cosmologies or forms of contact that the pre-flood world had possessed, but as potential, as the deep structure of a consciousness that had been shaped by immense and ancient influence and retained in its very nature the capacity to reach again toward what it had once, in another age, actually touched. This is what the flood story, read in this way, is actually preserving, not the memory of a catastrophe, the memory of a continuity, the idea that even in the most complete ending, something of the essential passes through, that the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity was not severed by the flood, it was transformed, carried forward in a different form, at a different level, with different implications for how that relationship could be expressed in the world that came after. And the world that came after was, in this reading, not a diminished version of what had existed before. It was a next stage. Harder, yes. More painful, certainly. More subject to the full weight of mortality and uncertainty and the particular suffering that comes from being a conscious being in a world that does not always seem to care about consciousness, but also more fully itself, more completely human in the sense that what was being developed in that post-flood world was something that the pre-flood world, for all its immense knowledge and careful structure, had not yet fully achieved. The capacity for human beings to find meaning, to build order, to reach toward the divine, not because beings of greater power were present and guiding and maintaining the conditions that made all of that possible, but because human beings had developed through the long schooling of their relationship with the Anunnaki, the internal resources to attempt it on their own. The ziggurats in this light are not monuments to absence. They are monuments to the attempt, to the extraordinary, painful, so sometimes magnificent human effort to maintain a connection across a distance that was always growing, to keep reaching towards something that was receding, not because it had abandoned the reaching, but because the reaching itself was the point, because the muscle that develops through the effort of reaching towards something just beyond your grasp is precisely the muscle that will eventually be capable of touching it. The Sumerian scribes who wrote down the king lists and the flood stories and the hymns to gods who were becoming increasingly distant understood something about this. even if they could not articulate it in these terms. They understood that what they were doing mattered, that the preservation of the memory, however imperfect, however partial, however distorted by the long passage of time and the inevitable drift of oral transmission, was not simply an act of cultural conservation. It was an act of faith, a statement that the connection had been real, that the withdrawal did not negate the reality of what had existed before it, and that something in the future would find these fragments and understand, in ways the scribes themselves could not fully anticipate, what they had been trying to preserve. They were writing for us, not specifically for us, not for this particular civilization, this particular night, but these particular minds reaching back through the darkness towards something they can feel but not quite name, but for the possibility of us. For whatever moment in the long future of the species, when enough of the fragments had been recovered, enough of the dust blown away from enough of the buried tablets, for something of the original picture to begin to emerge. We are living in that moment, and what is beginning to emerge is not simple. It is not the confirmation of any single theory or the vindication of any particular interpretation. It is something more like the slow recognition that the oldest human traditions are asking questions that the most recent human knowledge is only now developing the tools to begin approaching. Questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical world, about the deep history of the species and the possibility that what we have recorded represents a small fraction of what has actually occurred, about the cycles that operate at timescales so vast that human civilization in its entire recorded extent represents only a brief moment within them. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, beings of extraordinary ancient knowledge, or the memory of such beings, or the imperfect mythological residue of encounters with something that has no name in any human language, pointed in toward these questions, built their pointing into the very structure of the civilization they helped to shape, so that the questions would survive even when the beings who first posed them had withdrawn beyond any ordinary human access. What destroyed the Anunnaki world? Perhaps nothing destroyed it in the end. And perhaps what happened was not destruction, but transformation, the completion of a stage so vast and so slowly unfolding that the beings living through it could only experience it as loss, as withdrawal, as the aching absence of something that had once been present and warm and immediate and was now distant and cold and accessible only through the imperfect mediation of ritual and tradition and the kind of reaching that develops its own strength through the effort of reaching. Perhaps the Anunnaki world did not end. Perhaps it became something else. Perhaps it became this world, this night, this particular quality of quiet that descends in the hours before sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on the present and begins almost to spite itself, to drift towards something older and stranger and more spacious than the ordinary waking world allows. Perhaps the world they built is still here, transformed beyond recognition by the long passage of time and the accumulated weight of human history, but present in the deep structure of things, in the orientation of the oldest sacred sites toward the same astronomical alignments, in the persistence of certain stories across cultures so separated by geography and time that their sharing of those stories can only be explained by reference to something that preceded all of them, in the inexplicable sense felt by human beings in every era and every culture that has left any record of its inner life, that this world is not the only world, that something immense lies just beyond the ordinary edge of perception, that the silence, if you sit with it long enough, in the right kind of darkness, with the right kind of stillness, is not empty, that the silence knows something, and that what it knows is older than language, older than civilization, so older than the first reed pressed into the first piece of soft clay by the first human hand that understood in some way it could not yet fully articulate that what it had witnessed needed to be remembered, needed to be carried forward, needed to survive. So we arrive, finally, at that edge of what can be said, not the edge of what is true. That boundary lies far beyond anything language can reach, far beyond the fragments of clay and the partial translations and the careful, so grief-tinged attempts of ancient scribes to hold on to something immense before it faded entirely from the world. But the edge of what this particular night's telling can carry without breaking under the weight of its own reaching. The Sumerian Tablets did not give us answers. They were never meant to. What they gave us, what they have always given us, across every generation that has sat with them in the particular stillness that very old things require, is the quality of the question, the shape of a wondering so ancient and so persistent that it has survived flood and fire and the collapse of every civilization that has attempted to hold it. The sense that the world we inhabit is not the first world, that the silence at the edges of our ordinary perception is not empty silence, but inhabited silence, filled with the presence of something that withdrew rather than died, that receded rather than ended, that is still, perhaps, in some way that requires a different kind of attention than we usually bring to the task of perception here. The Anunnaki, as they are remembered, did not leave us alone. They left us everything they could carry through the ending, pressed into clay, built into the orientation of sacred sites, encoded in the movement of the stars that their astronomy taught the earliest human minds to read. They left us the questions. They left us the capacity to ask them. They left us the deep structure of a consciousness shaped by immense and ancient contact, capable, still, even now, even after all the noise and all the forgetting and all the long centuries of distance from whatever that contact once was, of reaching towards something it cannot fully name. Perhaps that reaching is itself the answer. Perhaps the Anunnaki world was not destroyed at all. Perhaps it simply reached the moment toward which it had always been quietly moving, the moment when what had been given was fully given, when the relationship between teacher and student had run its long and patient course, when the beings who had carried the earliest flame of ordered consciousness into a young and turbulent world could finally, gently, with something that might have felt like both grief and relief, set down what they had been carrying, and trust that what they had set in motion would continue, would find its own way, would remember in the long run, imperfectly, partially, in fragments pressed into clay and buried and recovered and only partially read, enough of what it had once been shown to keep reaching toward the light. It could feel but not quite see. Tonight, you are part of that reaching, and the silence that surrounds you now, deep and old and full of something that has no name, is not empty. It never was.